and then I had some problems with my computer.
Yeah.
Hi, Adam.
Hello.
We finally got Gitte to join us.
Yes, we did. I've been looking forward to this.
Well, we shall see.
I have, I don't know whether you saw, I posted something just now. I had a very bad cold and I'm still coughing. I'm still congested. I don't know how long I'll be able to stay with this. If I start coughing, I'm going to have to leave.
Or at
You
least
can
we
just
have,
mute your.
yeah, we'll have to mute you maybe. You can still stay.
But so far, so good.
Yeah.
Adam, you'll be interested. We've opened the synagogue for Shabbos.
Very nice.
So we now have, oh, I missed one Shabbos because of my cold. I wouldn't go there and cough my head off. Wouldn't be polite, right?
Right.
Enough Jewish for now.
No,
Have you been
it's fine.
tested?
Excuse me?
Have you been tested?
Well, he's fully vaccinated.
Oh, right.
Yes, I'm fully vaccinated. They tested me the day after they found out I had a cold, told me I couldn't go to the synagogue for another day.
Right.
I tested negative immediately.
Oh, okay.
They did a quick test. And, but the rules change daily. So for example, one day they said, you can't go into the dining room if you're coughing. The next day they said, go. You know, when you live in a nursing home, you live by the whims of the management.
I just did a stint of 10 days in hospital. It's the same thing. It's quite horrible.
Yep.
Where did I-
So far, my partner has been quiet, so I'll leave the audio on. If he turns his on, I'll turn my audio off.
Okay.
So we still have a couple of minutes.
Yeah,
Hour.
I logged on early because my computer is an antique and it takes me forever to get started. You know, it took me like 5 minutes to get the computer up and into Zoom. I'm sure your computers are much faster.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but back in the day, you had to start the computer an hour before you needed to use it. Right?
Yeah, but look, this is
I once had an employee who was a consultant at one of our customers turn up in the office and said that he refused to go to work because they had put a virus on his machine. They call it OS2, he said. That was back in the day.
I'm going to move out of the picture for a moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
My computer is so old that the sound is impenetrably bad unless I have my earphones on. So I'm going to go get them.
Well, Dom, I like the fact that I could click on the password on the APL wiki, and it brings up try APL, and there's the password.
Yeah.
Of course, I can remember the numbers, but
Oh, hell.
I need something to
Excuse me.
multiply them.
I'll be coming back.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I figured it's easier like that, and there's no way a bot that scrapes Zoom rooms in order to go and disturb people is going to figure that out.
Hello, Harry.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Just put it down.
So Harry, you're just as not outside as I am not in front of a campfire. Right?
That's true. I am not outside. But it looks like that outside right now, pretty much.
Oh,
We
that's
have great
nice.
weather. Not too hot, not too cold.
Adam, are you the host?
I am the host, yes.
Yeah,
You
can
you
you
need
take
permission to
over?
share?
Yes.
Okay. You should be able to now.
I disappeared.
No.
Oh, that's different.
Yeah, Devin, if you put a fake background, it can only handle one person at a time.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's the AI gets all confused. Okay.
Hi, Harry.
Gitte, you still can't share?
I don't get any share.
Well, I can try making you host, but normally it should just work to allow people to share.
Yeah, where would I find it? Under the more button, right?
Well, either the more, it should just have a green button that says,
Yeah, I don't have any green buttons.
On mine, it's the third button from the right or the left. It's the middle button. It says share screen.
Yeah, I haven't got that.
that's really interesting.
Are you
Well,
using a computer, a regular computer or a phone?
No, it's just a regular computer. And
Do you have a view up in the corner?
What did you mean?
a view of an opponent.
Message popped up.
No,
The
I
word
have no
view.
opponents here.
presence went away.
well, Gitte, I can make you proper host. Then you should. I think everybody here is allowed to share. So without any permission, but I'll make you host.
Yes, I've got permission to share, I
Yeah.
see.
So
I'm
you-
wondering,
I'm sharing with
if
everybody
possibly-
automatically, so.
Get out,
You
you moving the
gotta move
mouse?
you have to move your mouse into the window, the Zoom meeting window. You may
Yeah,
also want to
I'm there.
maximize the Zoom
I'm
meeting
clicking
window.
on the more. I have mute, stop video, and then more. And under more, I don't have anything. I have participants, invite, chat, record on this computer, record to the cloud breakout rooms.
Try hold in your Alt key and press S. Okay.
Right, seems to work. Right,
These
okay.
computers are confusing, aren't they?
Well,
I
Does Zoom
just have
have
memory.
different client options? Interesting.
The other day, I was trying to remember what hardware I had worked with over the years. And I came up with a very peculiar piece of hardware that I had, a Honeywell 800.
oh.
Now that's an old machine.
Mm-hmm.
So we see you're sharing really well. Thank you.
You see it now? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Brilliant.
Anybody who's not speaking should probably mute, and the quality is generally better.
Okay. I will mute for the time being.
Okay, so let me get started, and I don't know how long this is going to take because I don't know how much you're going to talk, but we'll just get started. So first a little bit about myself and how I got into APL. I actually studied biology at university, and I took the research education where you had biology with math, physics, and chemistry, and I graduated in '81. And then I was actually one of the first environmental biologists that graduated ever, but unfortunately, nobody had any jobs for this kind of biologist back then. So we had actually done some modeling. Thesis was on carbon flux in aquatic systems, sort of calculating from one level of the food chain to the next. And so we did a breakthrough discovery that bacteria actually was fed in part by some carbon that was exuded by plankton and not counted usually. Obviously, there were no jobs, as I said, so I got teacher training and tried teaching and realized I was going to get bored to death having to do the same curriculum every 3 years for the rest of my life. So I decided that was not for me. And one day I saw an ad in the newspaper that they were offering retraining to EDP for long-term unemployed academics. And I had been unemployed for a couple of months, so I thought that was a long time, and I applied and got accepted.
That's electronic data processing, right?
Yes, it was what we called it back in the days. In Danish, it was EDB. So that was what IT was called back then. Lots of things have changed that none of you young guys have experienced. So they taught us fortran and cobol and systemering, which is planning of IT projects, data analysis and stuff like that. But after 6 weeks of fortran and 4 weeks of cobol with declarations, loops, actually I was pretty good at fortran. I could get it to calculate almost everything, but I couldn't get it to show me the result because you had to predict how many numbers came out and how wide they were. Otherwise, you got an error instead. And obviously it was a bit of a problem to get the data into the program because you had to get it from file and you had to know where it was and you had to know what kind of data came from the file, otherwise it wouldn't accept it. So when I saw this, the first day they taught us APL, they showed us this expression, 1, 2, 3 plus 4, 5, 6. And the result just came out, 5, 7, 9. Is it no declarations, no loops, and it just tells you what the result is. I was told, why did they bother with all that other stuff? This I could have used while I was studying. In particular, I did all of the models for that carbon flux thing on a Texas 51A pocket calculator that was programmable with a 2K program memory card. So I was sold on APL and I got really lucky because I got an internship with IP Sharp Associates. Apparently they had noticed that I really loved APL, and so they suggested that I got the internship that they had offered. And after the internship, I got hired. So that was a wonderful time. That company was just a marvel to work for. I mean, it was so full of bright people and of all sorts of colors and genders, natural and taken. There were about 600 people in 50 different countries, all connected via email. We had this 666 box that the STSC people also had. I mean, I think the first version was actually written at STSC and then was rewritten at IP Sharp for more production need. And we had this packet switched international network that allowed us to talk to each other across the globe because we had quite a few large multinational companies as customers, and they wanted to be able to share data across borders and also communicate with each other. So that was a service that IP Sharp provided back then.
Which year was this?
What?
Which year was this approximately?
This was in '83. I first got hired, but I mean, they'd had it for quite some years before that because I mean, they had an office in Denmark, and that's not the first place you think of having an office. So, yep, and also they had offices when you traveled. The offices looked just the same with the same sort of mauve colors. So when you went into an office, you felt immediately at home, and you found the nearest typewriter terminal, and you could then download your mail. It consisted of getting it written out on striped paper, and then you could take it away with you and read it over coffee or beer later. But the funny thing is, I mean, that speaking to people via email, you got to actually know each other quite well. And all these people I got to know back then, it feels like family when we meet. And it's not long ago that we actually celebrated 50 years of since IP Sharp was founded in Toronto with Iron Sharp present. Unfortunately, Ian passed away this month, or no, last month in July. And seeing all these Sharpies as we,
I knew Ian.
yeah. He's a lovely, lovely guy. And I mean, he was just running a 21st century organization back in the 80s. It was, I mean, there was absolutely no fuss. And when you were asking, what can I spend on the company's bill? And ask yourself, would you use your own money to buy this? If the answer is yes, you can spend the company's money. And I mean, it was like that, just no nonsense, and use your own judgment, and people were trusted. So I think everybody who's worked for that company still longs back to it and tries to recreate it to this day, because it was a really, really nice place to work.
So that's where you get it from.
Mhm.
In dialogue, we're told the same thing by the CEO.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it was really good. So what happened when I joined IP Sharp? Well, a customer had read about Magic Store, and that was a multi-dimensional time series database that IP Sharp had made. First, they'd made it simply to keep time series from all the financial markets all over the world. They were collected, and sort of the junior assignment at the office was to every day take the newspaper and type in the currency rates for this market and the interbank interest rates. So that had to be done every day for all the different markets in the world. And that went into the multidimensional time series database. But there was also a version of it where you could use to build your own databases. And this guy has read about that, and he wanted an international corporate consolidation application developed for the company where he worked as a financial controller, because they had maybe 50 subsidiaries and needed an overview of their finances. This is an example of Magic Store. You can simply, there was also an accompanying workspace called Magic that was meant for financial analysis. And then you could just specify how you wanted the data out of the database, quarterly dated, first quarter 75 to fourth quarter 78. Scale 0, you could scale 1,000 or millions or whatever. Display the international financial, whatever. France, and 71 is the item 71 on the list of probably commodities or papers or stocks or whatever. And then you just get this table. Obviously, this is a typewriter interface, but you'll notice the language. It's what today is called a domain-specific language. It's a language for financial analysts, so they can define their search and they can define their report as well. So that was a pretty good tool. I didn't have to code a database, fortunately. So I just started at IP Sharp after 4 weeks of APL training. I had some knowledge of accounting because I'd been doing it as summer jobs while I was studying. So I got the assignment. I knew nothing about financial consolidation, but the user did, and he was available to me while I was coding. And as my boss, Johnny Larson, said at the time, it's just one big plus reduction and then a bit of householding. How hard could it be? So I started, and the requirement spec was about 30 subsidiaries should be able to enter 50 accounts each month. Budget for the year was done in October and typed in. 2 types of companies and account sheets, production companies and sales companies. And then the end user had to commit data ahead of deadline and get a receipt back. Then once all the data were in each month, you would have to consolidate. That's the big plus reduction. Consolidate all subsidiaries to parent and group, eliminate intercompany trading, post earnings from subsidiaries correctly in the balance, print receipt report to subsidiaries, and print report for parent and group. And then account sheets and group charts were also what I got as requirement specs. So 1.5 meter or 6 feet, if you count in feet. And 2 months later, the system was in test for the half-year result of the company. And at the end of 83, it was in production doing the consolidation for the group.
Does this mean when you printed out all the code on paper, it was 1.5 meters of code?
Yes.
That's
And I say
very
that
little.
tongue in cheek because it was one long program. And it was jumping in and out.
So one
And I-
APL function, one giant APL?
One big giant APL function that used the database workspace from IP Sharp, of course, and did calls to that. But the logic of that application was a one long function.
So it must have, so was it interactive? So it prompted the user for information?
Oh,
as it
yeah,
went
yeah,
along?
yeah, absolutely. It allowed the users to type in, and it detected what kind of user it was, whether it was a financial controller or it was the end user or whatever.
So it corresponds to GUI programming today.
Yeah.
Meaning you had all the front end and the back end together in all this code, but still
Yeah.
1.5 meters is very little for a full system.
Absolutely. And the funny thing was that my boss sort of, he mumbled a bit when he saw that. And then he said, maybe you should try and send it to this guy in Sweden who's a very good programmer. His name is Örjan Wikstrand, and he's also working for IP Sharp. So I sent it, and I got an email back almost as long as the code with all his suggestions for how I could make this program better. I knew nothing about coding applications at the time, but I still got something working. And I didn't understand what he had written to me. But then later, they wanted a budget currency and a real currency and all sorts of changes. And at that point, I started to realize what it was that Örjan had told me, because it sort of jumped up and down the code depending on this or that condition. And sometimes it jumped past some assignment of a variable, so I had to reassign it. It was a bit disorderly. So I read Örjan's email again, and then I understood, in fact, at that point, what he had suggested to me, and I started to decompose the code into small subroutines and stuff that could be called whenever necessary. So I learned by doing. There was no long theoretical study in front of this. It was just, I realized I simply couldn't get control of that code if I didn't organize it better, and started doing that. But that was how life at IP Sharp was. I mean, you had all these resources available to you over the email, and they would just help you. No questions asked. I mean, you ask a question, there's people falling over their feet to help you. It was actually really, really nice. But this is what I always liked about APL. You can have this domain experts who understand something other than coding and APL with a deep knowledge of something, and then a friend who's a bit computer literate knowing APL. You can develop quite a complex system in a very short time. As long as you know what you're doing, you can tell the computer what to do. So would I have been happy with this spec today? Yeah, absolutely. I knew exactly what the functionality was required, and I had a full overview of the data. And the thing is, complex systems is a bit of a problem these days, because they have an enormous amount of people working together trying to accomplish something complex. And if you're lucky, one of these persons actually understand what needs to be done. And the project is really blessed if there is that person who can also actually explain it to the other guys and communicate with the user. If not, you get these systems that are never actually getting off the ground. And I knew I could get answers to my questions when I knew what they were from the user. And I could show him every time I'd done a part of the user interface, I could show him how it worked. And as this wise saying at the bottom of the page says, human beings are very poor at explaining to you exactly what they want, but as soon as they see something, they know exactly what they don't want. And that's the process with developing systems in APL. Get something in front of the user as soon as possible so they can tell you what's wrong with it and what they really want. You need a context to have that discussion. And I had that available to me. So it was something I learned quite early on. And today they call it extreme programming or agile programming. Admittedly, I also only had to do a user interface that consisted of quote input. We had something called answer ahead. You could sort of train the answers ahead and you could put that into the buffer. So if to start a user up, you just put all the right answers in that pertain to that user and they would bring them exactly where they wanted to be. We had a help system. So if you, in the middle, instead of answering the prompt, you typed help, you would get an explanation what to do at this point. And then there was the quad FMT formatting of the results. And there were libraries at IP Sharp for all these things, how to do that in the best possible way. I have to admit that if I got that requirement spec today, I would have a hard time figuring out how to create the user interface with the tool chains available today for Windows and browsers and Macs and whatever. And it doesn't work the same way in any of the environments, and you'll have to do at least 3 or 4 of them to make it look the same across platforms. And that's something we're also struggling with finding a solution to at Dialog. Yeah, I promised Adam I might tell you about when I met Ken Iverson first time. He actually visited the IP Sharp office at one occasion, and I was completely mystified because this guru, this big hero of everybody, came to me asking me how to sign on to the system. And I was deeply mystified. Well, it turns out he usually signed on from the Toronto office, who was directly connected to the mainframe. But when he got into one of the local offices, you first had to establish the connection to Toronto before you could sign in. And he didn't know how to do that. So it was not like he didn't know how to use the system. It was just he didn't know how to use it from Copenhagen. He was really, he was a wonderful person. I remember I challenged him on the name of Ravel. He said, why did you choose such a strange name for make vector of? And he said, but Ravel, it's like when you're knitting and you knit something and then you discover you made an error and then you take the thread and you just unravel it. That's why it's called that. And I've never forgotten that because it was actually a very appropriate name, but I just didn't know that word in English. So, okay, so the organizations around APL. Well, the first time I really experienced that was in '84, where we were sent to the International APL conference. That was in Helsinki in Finland. And Johnny sent all four of us, all four developers at the Copenhagen office of IP Sharp, because he said, that's the only way you're gonna really learn something outside of IP Sharp. There you can get some knowledge that we might not provide internally. And it was a complete eye-opener. There was 450 APL people from all sorts of hardware companies that made APL machines, software companies that made other APLs, and consultancies that worked with customers doing APL programming for them. And all of these guys were just completely forthcoming, and we had a lot of beers, I think. It was a wonderful event, and some of the people I met back then is actually still my friends, and I see them regularly, like once a year. The big topic on that conference was, IBM had just announced DB2, the big database, and obviously they needed some kind of data structure in APL that could hold these tuples. And so IBM was proposing its nested arrays, and IP Sharp, or in particular, Ken Iverson, was not very happy with that theory underlying those nested arrays. So there was a split down the community over the two different approaches. But that went sort of more or less over our head. We made a lot of new friends and listened to very deep explanations of prototypes of arrays and stuff like that. And heard about applications of APL from people who had done wonderful systems. And it was such an inspiration that both Morten and I continued. Yeah, by the way, Morten, very early on when I started working for IP Sharp, I got an unsolicited email one day, and we had no spam filters in those days either. And that was Morten, who had discovered a new person had arrived at the Copenhagen office. So we started communicating, and about a year later, he moved in with me. So that's how I got a husband too, with APL, or at least with Mailbox. It was completely unfashionable in those days. But we continued to go to all these international conferences because, first of all, to meet with the people, and secondly, to learn about all the new stuff, and thirdly, to try and sell some of the stuff we did ourselves in some cases. Unfortunately, they died out in the early noughties. But today, we do once a year a user meeting, not in these COVID times, but usually at Dialogue. And it's great to see all these people in person every year and have a meal with them. And in '85, my boss got tired of representing the local IP Sharp at the local APL special interest group at the Danish Data Association. So he decided that he would send me instead. And I got together with a couple of other people, and we decided that we would try and get the APL conference to Copenhagen. And in 1987, we won the bid on the 90 conference. So it's like a time frame of the Olympics. You started very early on. You had to negotiate. You had to get the papers in very early because the proceeding had to be produced, and it took at least half a year. And then again, just before, 2 weeks before we had the conference, the hotel we were going to have it in went bankrupt, and we had to move the whole thing to a different city and a different hotel. But we did it, and it worked. In the preparations, as I said, there was this big split down the community on how the second generation arrays should actually be built. I had completely underestimated that split in the community. But Iverson had left IBM over it and joined IP Sharp instead. In 90, he had now retired and had made his own pet project. He had worked on rationalized APL and extended it and created J. He wanted to actually make a version of APL that could be used in schools. And schools had severe problems with the APL character set back in those days when we only had 128 characters to do with. So he decided to go with this ASCII version of it, which I wish he hadn't. But anyways, he just finished developing it with Roger Huey and had submitted some paper to the 90 conference. Now at the program committee, we had Sharpies and RBM people and STSC people and users and whatever. And the IBM representatives was dead against accepting these papers on J, because it had nothing to do with APL at all, they argued. I mean, it obviously had, because it was the Sharp variety, but such was the opposition that the program chair came to me and said, you have to do something because I'm not getting through with these guys. So I did something that I do very, very rarely as a manager. I had to issue an executive order and told everybody that you don't reject a paper by Ken Iverson at an APL conference. And so Jay was presented for the first time in APL 90. And that was the beginning of that. It also had another interesting thing, the 90 conference in Copenhagen. It was the first time we had Russian people visiting the conference. They were let out after the wall had come down. And we had a visit, apart from these two guys, from the KGB, who demanded at the registration desk to get a copy of the proceedings. And we told them they would have to buy it like everybody else. You couldn't just give it away. But that was interesting. I mean, obviously they were afraid that secrets were given away, but it was not. So what happened next? Well, obviously I could have continued to work for IP Sharp for as long as it existed, but in 1988 it was sold to Reuters. Reuters wanted, well, Reuters is a funny company. It started by sending doves, sort of, what is it called, messenger doves, or from Paris to London with all news of the races or the prices of stocks and stuff like that. And Reuters just continued that tradition. So when it started to become telegraphic, they just took that data and presented it to their users and lost it. So they hadn't gathered any historical information. And by that time, the personal computers had started to become frequent with financial analysts. And so they wanted historical data so they could do predictions and analysis of what happened back in time and stuff. And IP Sharp had actually collected all that data. So Reuters was very interested in the databases that IP Sharp had collected. But I don't think they ever discovered they had also bought a software company. They started to spit out the software part again, one by one, closing down the offices, the local ones of IP Sharp. And because a lot of the staff was just situated in the local offices and the communication was done by email, some quite important people were sitting quite remote from the head office, but that did not figure on Reuters. So I think they actually didn't really understand that what they were doing were losing part of their own investment, because they lost quite a lot of good people by closing down those offices. Of course,
I would
very
like to make a
importantly, the
comment about that
Copenhagen
later when
one,
you're
which
taking
was closed
questions.
down in 90. But we were 3 people there who thought that maybe there was still some consultancy to be had with the IP Sharp mainframe customers of Copenhagen or Denmark as such. And so we started a small company called Insight Systems and put it in Elsinore, where we all 3 of us lived by coincidence. So that went well for a couple of times, and we tried to do other projects than working for the mainframe customers, because they were quite faceless. They would sort of have one project and then they would have nothing for a while. But that was really hard, trying to match competent resources to projects. And when one quarter we had actually started to hire people, but then one customer decided to go public, so they stopped all projects. Another customer had ordered a project, but the new guy who was trying to make things happen hadn't discovered that he had to apply for the money the quarter before he wanted to use them. And the last one, yeah, that was a bank, and they got bought. So suddenly everything was in limbo, because they were evaluating all the systems and comparing the 2 bank systems to which one should survive. I mean, as it was, ours survived, but not until a year later. So we decided that we were approached by a company called Datum Limited, who wanted us to do a major work for them. They wanted us actually to create a client server version of their software. And the software was a budgeting and planning application that had been developed internally at IBM when they stopped doing completely centralized budgeting and started to decentralize it to the departmental level. And at one of these departments, this guy had developed the budgeting and planning application. It was very smart. It would take all your numbers from last year, and then you could sort of modify what you wanted to happen next year, and it would break down using last year's data as a model. So basically, I mean, you could say, I just want 10% more on the bottom line, tell me how to do it, and it could do it. But of course you could adjust some of them. You say you can't touch the salaries because they are what they are, and you also have to keep the building heated and stuff like that. But it was a really good application, and you could completely build a model of the cash flow in a big organization and then work with that to see what you could change and what not. At that point, it was an MS-DOS application, and they were already rewriting it to Windows. And we were, as I said, hired to make the client server version. But when we saw the Windows version, Morten said, we have to rewrite that. It's not going to work. The one thing they had done, which was really, really, really smart, was they had built a very efficient sales funnel, a way of approaching customers and making sales. And it really worked. When we joined, they were about 20 people and we were 5. And by the time 5 years later, a Datum was sold to Cognos, we were 250 in total. And then Cognos went and got bought by IBM. So the application ironically ended up where it started. And the latest news is IBM has actually sold it because they made something themselves that didn't use APL. And so they have sold it to the guys who previously owned STSC, the financial reporting system, Erik Balen and his guys. Well, I don't think Erik Balen himself is involved, but some of those people are now having a datum planning, which is now called Cognos planning, I think, even if it was IBM. So the product still lives, which is satisfying in a way. So in all that turmoil, these new owners didn't find a development department in Denmark a very smart idea. So we found ourselves back as a small consulting company, Insight Systems second. And in 2004, we were approached by a couple of customers from Dialog, asking us to find a succession to the then current management of Dialog, who had made noises at their user meeting about playing golf more than now, and talk loudly about retiring. So they got a little bit anxious because they had their business built on Dialog APL. And so we tried to find somebody who could manage that, and we had to give up. So these customers insistently encouraged us to fall on our own swords and take on the role ourselves. And so we did. We got some money out of a datum being sold to Cognos, so we could sort of we could buy into the company. So it was a management buy-in. So after having tried a lot of different things, consulting, making software, doing tools, we are now back where we started with an APL vendor. I think it's been an enjoyable journey. At least we've never had a dull moment, always something new to ponder. And the real joy about APL is that you are constantly exposed to new ideas, very often at the forefront of what's happening out there, and some very interesting people. And of course, you're always capable of telling the computer what to do when you need to solve a problem, which is a great benefit. Yep, that was all from me.
And
Some questions?
I see Joey Tuttle switch off his video, but I think he wanted to make a comment or question before, but maybe
Yeah.
when he'll be back, I don't know, he might be away from the computer.
I have an interesting comment, I think. You started with Fortran.
Yep.
Believe it or not, my first successful programming job was done in Fortran 4 for the president of CBS.
Oh,
And
yeah,
that dragged me in directly because the systems people were bringing in a 360 and nobody had no systems programmers, and the manager there said, gee, he at least has some knowledge of scientific programming, maybe he'll join us. And he recruited me, and that's how I became a programmer.
Yeah. Well, we actually was taught at university in math about a program called LIMP, and it was based on algol W, and it could actually do multidimensional arithmetic. It needed declarations and it needed type declarations, but you could make arrays, which was not very often seen in programming languages back then.
I don't know whether my understanding in Fortran led me naturally into APL, because I used all sorts of subroutines and subprograms in my Fortran programming just to keep it simple.
Yeah, it does help. that you don't have to repeat the same code over and over again. And try to remember where you've been there once before.
Well, as somebody once said to me, it's not the go-to that's the problem, it's the come from.
Yeah.
How the hell did you get here, right?
Yeah, and what has happened since I went away?
Joey, you wanted to make a comment before?
Yeah, Gitte, thank you for the excellent talk. That was very enjoyable to revisit history. I think we got to know each other pretty early on in your joining IP Sharp Associates.
Yeah, at least I remember you receiving me in when the conference was in California.
Yes.
And we sat there at a cafe. You took me to a cafe and served me a latte, and then you went off to do a phone call. And this beggar come up to me and asked if I had a few bucks for a cup of coffee. And he's carrying a mobile phone. And that was in, I think it must have been in late 90, because the one at Stanford was in 91, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And these were not, they were very rare beasts in Denmark. So this must be the land of milk and honey, where even the beggars have mobile phones.
Still true. Too bad Harry Saal dropped off. He would confirm that.
Yeah. No, it was, I think they probably handed it out to people who were homeless so that they could get in contact with them.
They still do.
Mm. Yeah.
It's one of our few socially supportive programs in California.
Right.
Yeah, well,
Yep.
I mean, there are others, but it's still a significant one. But I wanted to comment your first job in Magic and your 1.5 meters of listing. Magic was always, I always watched it with some interest, and the most amusing bug I ever saw, which you could say was because of lack of specification, was how you exited Magic. Was you were in a quad prime input as you specified, and you typed the word quit. And that was much longer than Q, which does it in some things nowadays. But the way it worked in Magic was that the quad prime input had a 4 take, and it said if QUIT identically equal to 4 take of the input, quit. And that worked great until somebody started entering data from Quito, Ecuador.
Right.
So these old stories, I think it's wonderful, Adam, that you're doing this, because some of these old stories would just definitely be lost, and they're, interesting. And about the Reuters transition, there was a technical meeting about a year, it was not quite a year into the time of after their acquisition, where they sent a very impressive team of technical people from England to Toronto, and we had a 2-day conference, and our people presented what they had been doing and what they were doing, starting with Leslie Goldsmith talking about the things he was doing and the databases and communications and so on. And these guys at the lunch break, I was standing there, and they came up and they said to Leslie, gosh, we had no idea what you guys were all about. And I hope that Reuters doesn't screw this up. Actually, they used a more indiscreet word than that. And Leslie looked at them and he said, I think it's too late. And of course, that was a prophetic statement.
Yep.
And when you talked about the irony of a company starting in IBM, going out, getting acquired, coming back, and rejoining IBM, that reminded me of another APL pioneer that Adam can't have on his talk, Alex Morrow. And if I'm going to sign up to do one of these too, and I'll tell more Alex stories, but he was interesting in the fact that he took a leave from IBM to be in the free software world back in the day when that was a beginning. And he moved from there. He decided not to come back to IBM. He went to Lotus 1, 2, 3 work. And he became a Lotus Fellow. So when Lotus was acquired by IBM, he became an IBM Fellow. So it was the most unusual circuit for somebody to become an IBM Fellow. He joined IBM working for one, Ken Iverson. Well, Ken became a fellow after he had joined. And he ended up being one himself through this very strange path. And I miss Alex sorely. So I think we all do. He was a source of great quotes and so on. And those are my comments. And thanks again for your very excellent presentation.
Well, you reminded me of one of the anecdotes about Reuters when they discovered the email system, the e-box. They demanded that it was constructed or amended such that you couldn't address anybody more than one level about you in the hierarchy, because they found it very disorderly that you could just, for instance, send an email to Ian Sharp if you wanted. How would they control information flow if somebody could just go around them and talk to their next boss?
But from what I've heard about Sharp, wasn't that intentional?
Yes.
Of course it was. But Reuters didn't like that. I mean, you had to follow the hierarchy, yeah? If you wanted to report something up in the system, it had to be filtered by your manager and then his manager and his manager. And I'm saying his deliberately. I just saw, because when Ian passed away, there was a lot of postings, and Roger Huey has collected some anecdotes, and there was a quote from Lib Gibson, and she said, "I left IP Sharp thinking that this gender bias was highly exaggerated." Yeah, right.
Yes, good observation.
Yeah, but
And-
that's the thing about IP Sharp. It didn't matter what color you were, what gender you were. It was your competence and your willingness to work with people that counted. That's
Yeah,
what got you respect.
apparently it didn't matter what level you were at either.
No.
I've read some of these anecdotes, Ian Sharp answering the phone, helping people programming APL, things like that. And the customer not realizing who it is they're talking to.
He was originally an operation research guy, so he was sharp.
So to speak.
In both senses of the word. Curtis Jones wrote in chat here asking how many levels were there of management at IPSA?
3 at most.
And
I'm reminded of a story that from that level thing. I was at an IP Sharp conference once in Toronto, and I had been, well, I was at the time, it was during the Reuters time. I was at vice president of whatever at Reuters. And this young man came up to me and started chatting me up as though I was a customer. And I said, well, I work here at Sharp. And he said, oh, what would you say you do? And I said, I would say I was your boss. And he said, what? What do you mean? And I said, well, you work for David Keith in the database department, right? And he said, right. And I said, well, David reports to me. And he said, oh. He was quite chagrined. I mean, it was funny. And Ian would have done exactly the same thing. Like, what do you do here?
Yeah. But I mean, this guy has not been destroyed by the Reuters.
Yeah, I suppose this is not supposed to be a Reuters bashing thing, but I'll add one more story and then I'm going to shut up. Maybe. When Roger and Ken were working on J in 1989, Roger, his official project in my department was building a financial transactions terminal. And it was at the time based on a Sun workstation when they had just introduced Intel processors. And he and Andrew North had a great product put together working. They demonstrated it to Glenn Renfrew, whose comment about it was, it's lacking in color. And the thing was, Roger and Andrew in particular said, well, we followed the specifications of Reuters for colors. So they were all very bland. Anyway, the point of the story is that Reuters went on to select a different project from an outfit, which I can't even remember the name of, in Connecticut, because they wanted to compete with Bloomberg, who had a rather remarkable success with their data terminal. And I believe that Roger and Andrew's terminal would have competed very successfully against Bloomberg. So turns that were not taken and forks in the road that went the wrong way. I'll shut up. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not surprising because we had a successive train of new managers whom we were reporting to in the Copenhagen office, because Reuters had this habit of circulating management every 3 months so that they wouldn't get to know too much about what was going on, was our theory. Yeah, we should probably not say, maybe we get sued by these anecdotes.
And then I have another question from Rory, which is, you mentioned trying fortran and cobol before seeing APL. And have you tried any other programming languages?
Yeah, I did this algol W, and then we did some coding on the Texas machine, and we also did some correlation analysis. And I'm not sure what that was done in. That was done on some mainframe, which we got donated, I think, 10 minutes of machine time at one point from somebody who hadn't used up his quota. So yeah, but no, I done basic ones, but I got tired of typing before I finished the program.
Very nice. Okay, well, our hour is almost up. Any last questions? This is your time.
I'm just going to comment that the action of Alex Morrow becoming an IBM fellow, because he had been a fellow at the previous company, was following a precedent that Ken Iverson set. Of course, when he went to Sharp, he became a fellow there.
Yep.
Right, so yeah, I wanted to ask about that actually. I don't know if you know, but what did Ken Iverson do at IP Sharp?
He was fighting with Arthur Whitney.
Actually,
He was a fellow. He did whatever he wanted.
exactly. The definition of a fellow at IBM and anywhere else is that you do what you want.
Yes.
And at IBM, was a specific term of 5 years. And at IP Sharp, he had respect of everybody, and that worked well.
Yeah.
He, by the way, reported to me as well. So that was an interesting switch in roles since I worked for him. Well, I didn't actually work for him because he didn't want to be a manager at IBM. I worked for Aidan Falkoff for years. And
But I mean, one of the things he actually did was the rationalized APL.
yes.
Which was a beautiful document, a very small volume of completely concise description of the new operators, rank and under and all these things. I mean, rank was the most marvelous thing I've ever come across. It was incredibly productive in understanding how data flowed through functions or operators. I mean, we recreated it at Dialog because everybody from Sharp who worked for Dialog said, but we miss rank.
But wasn't that Arthur Whitney's invention?
Which?
The rank
I'm
operator?
not sure that
No.
it was, but he built it into the kernel of the HB 1000 machine he built in Australia.
Yes.
So Arthur's contribution was, I think, the row major thing and building that into the kernel of the interpreter. But I think the rank was probably Ken's idea.
Okay.
Yes.
I have to leave for another webinar, but thank you very much, Gitte.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
Good to see
I think we have to round it off. I'll of all the things that have been mentioned here, I'll try to make links to as much as I can of it from the APL Campfire article on APL Wiki. Thank you everybody for showing up, and obviously for Gitte. It's been great. I'm really happy that you got through this. Gitte is always very humble, and she doesn't speak about herself and what she has done. When I created APL Wiki articles about various people, then I wanted to write about Gitte, and I couldn't find anything. Then I asked some colleagues, where can I find things about what materials about what Gitte have been doing? So they referred me to various texts she has written and people have written, and she apparently has this tendency to avoid the question and speak about other people's accomplishments instead of her own. So I really appreciate I was able to break through this and put some of this in the record so it doesn't get lost. So thank you so much, everybody.
And now you got me hooked, so now I have to come back in a month.
Oh, you're always welcome. And in 4 weeks, we'll be back next episode. And I hope to see you there. The guest of honor next time is Ray Polivica, who really has a long history, and I'm sure he has more stories to tell than can be told in an hour, but we'll see. So thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.